Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Lisa Stutz. I'm the museum director for the museum. Before we start the program, I want to make a few general announcements of upcoming programs and things that are going on. Next Saturday, we will have our Veterans Genealogy class, 1 p.m. at the museum in person, and Terry is going to be doing the program. Registration for the program is going to be online, and you can register that now. It's a free event. An ongoing thing that we're doing through the Friends of the Museum, they are doing a silent auction fundraiser of a dollhouse. And the dollhouse is currently in our reading room. And you can, if you're interested in putting a bid, we have this that you can put in your bid. The bid does not close until December 2nd at the 4-H Craft Fair. And just general housekeeping notes, we do ask that if you have a cell phone, to put it on silent. And if you're looking for the restrooms, they are downstairs. And now I will turn it over to Dan Grenard, Kathy Herrin, Ed Norden, and Mark Van Rhyn.
My name's Dan. I think a lot of you kind of know who I am. What I'm going to do is kind of give a quick background on how this story came to be. It was does everybody kind of know who Marshall Felch is? Marshall Felch is a dinosaur excavator, very well known for dinosaur excavations in the Bone Wars. And last year, Joanne and I were at the Smithsonian, and we saw him in some of Marshall's work in the new dinosaur exhibit hall at the Smithsonian. And 3 complete dinosaur skeletons were excavated by Marshall Felch in the 1883 to 1886 time period. And they were exceptionally well done. And they had to be well done to have made it that far that they're still on display today. So he's a really well known in the dinosaur world. And these are all Jurassic dinosaurs. But he's also known for this story. And this story, the first time I ever heard it was from his offspring, him and his wife, Amanda. And they arrived here in Canyon City back in 1866. And Marshall and Amanda were here for it was about 10 years before dinosaurs were first discovered, and then you ended up with a lot more. But the family didn't know anything, the offspring of the family didn't know anything about the dinosaur work. What they knew was a story that they knew as, they called it Dead Man's Canyon. And in that story, Marshall Felch played the major role. And that's kind of what we're doing tonight, because it's a great, really interesting story. And the first time I ever heard it, I thought, that's kind of the craziest story I ever heard. I've never seen anything like it, and it didn't make any sense at first. But then after I kind of got the backdrop on the story, over time, it became kind of more interesting. And it's really kind of a fascinating story. I call it kind of a murder mystery in a certain sense. And he has some really interesting helpers to help him solve that. But the story started actually in 1883, and a reporter from Denver by the name of Eugene McCarthy, and they called him Fitz Mac. He's a Denver Herald journalist, And he was on his way here to Canyon City to get a story on Marshall's work excavating dinosaurs. Marshall was sworn to secrecy and he couldn't tell anything about the work he was doing. But he did tell him kind of an offbeat story that became published as Talking Rocks. At that same time, this Fitzmac hung over for a couple of days with a cold. And during that time period, Marshall told him a story that had happened back in 1867. And it was in the same place where, if you all have driven up 115 to Colorado Springs, and when you get pretty close, you go through that one real pretty canyon, and then you hang a right, and then you go up around the corner. And you guys may have known that there was a grave there along the side of the road of a guy named Henry Harkins. And that story comes from the murders that took place in 1863, and one of them was in that same canyon. That was the Henry Harkins. Marshall's story takes place in that same location. So when Fitzmac came down, he asked him about this, and Marshall decided to share it. So he shared this story over a period of time. And then 6 months later, Fitzmax wrote to him. And when he wrote to him, he said, March 6, 1884, he said, "I have been requested to prepare for the Sunday issue of our papers a little series of tales, which, combining as much interest as can be imparted to short stories of this character, shall possess in some instance some real historical fact connected with the early times of Colorado. Times fraught, as we know, with heroism, romance, and tragedy. And I should not feel myself under the greatest obligation if you would write out that for me that very little singular story you related to me when I was on your ranch. I refer to the story of Dead Man's Canyon, and I beg to say that if you would just write it in the same simple, straightforward way in which you related, it will not only be printed without alteration, but will, in my opinion, make a much better impression than if too carefully elaborated. I regard the story of unusual scientific interest." And he goes on to discuss that there's a kind of a growing interest in that sort of thing at the time. "The remarkable coolness, my dear Captain," he calls him Captain, with which you pass through that experience, which would be perfectly horrifying to most people, gives great scientific value to your impressions, and I hope you will give them the most minute details. Do not fear that if you will make your story tedious by this means, for it is the impressions on your own singularly cool mind that I wish to draw out. Trusting you will give my request your early and earnest attention. I remain, dear sir, with perfect esteem." And then at the end he says in a PS, "I must encourage you to writing it because I thought you did not attach as much importance to it as I did when you related it." And about 2 weeks later, he received Marshall's letter with the story. And at that time he said, before he introduced the story, he said, "I'm just going to tell you who he is, Marshall Felch is," because people didn't know who he is. Some of us here tonight don't know who he is. So it says, I will assist the understanding of the reader by explaining that Captain Felch, a shrewd, well-informed New Englander, has been for several years engaged by the United States government, excavating fossilized remains from the Upper Jurassic Formation of the Canyon of Oil Creek. The point is of great scientific interest, and the work is conducted by Professor Marsh of Yale College. And he goes on to discuss it a little bit more, tell you a little bit more about Marshall, but then he says, "It was there one evening when I first heard the singular story by which Captain Felch has so graphically related in the letter that follows. The natural bent of the man's mind toward accurate research has been brought out in this correspondence. And he's asking him to really elaborate and tell this story, really make it, give all the details that he could possibly do. And so with that, about 2 or 3 weeks later, the letter from Marshall arrives, and the letter's got what happened, the story that Marshall had told him a year earlier. And it's actually a story about something that happened to Marshall in 1867, not long after he and Amanda first arrived, coming west after the Civil War. They're both Civil War veterans. And they arrived here in Canyon City and bought land up in Garden Park. So with that, Ed is going to start out and tell you what Marshall said in his letter.
My letter, dated March 20th of 1884. Dear sir, I've received your letter of the 6th asking me to repeat the story I once related to you of Dead Man's Canyon. The unsuccessful efforts I have already made to comply with your request convince me that it is one thing to tell a story and quite another to write it. But to be brief, since brevity is the soul of wit, and tediousness the wet blanket that smothers attention, I will begin. I enlisted in the 4th Regiment of Vermont Volunteers in July 1861 for 3 years. A young man named Oliver Kimball enlisted in the same company as me. We never became what you could call friends, yet I knew him and liked him. His disposition was marked by great kindness and gentleness, but he was gloomy and cared little for the harum-scarum society of camp life. I knew in an indefinite sort of way that he was in love with a young lady at home, beautiful and good, but far above him in social position. He was a poor young man, and her father was rich. We among the boys who knew him in camp attributed his gloom to unrequited affections. I shared this opinion with the others until the Battle of Antietam, where Kimball was wounded in the shoulder. I was detailed to carry him to the rear, and finding he had fainted when I laid him down behind a barn. We were out of range of bullets when I hastily tore open his shirt and ripped off his sleeves with my knife to see if his hurt was fatal. Imagine my surprise to find on his arm, above the elbow, one of those thick bands of gold, fashionable as bracelets, on which were engraved the words, "In life and death, yours, Gertrude." Well, the wound proved not to be serious, and he soon revived. When most of us took advantages of the high bounty and the commutation of time to re-enlist in January 1864, he declined to join, served his time out, and went home in July to marry his faithful Gertrude, as we all supposed, though he took none of us into his confidence on that point. We heard a little later that he had not married his sweetheart, but had left for Colorado to go into the mines after remaining at home a few days. In 1866, I came to Colorado after the close of the war myself, and leaving my family in Denver, embarked in the business of freighting. This took me all over the territory, and especially over the routes leading from Denver, Colorado City, and Canyon City, in what was known as the Southern Mines, which meant the districts around Leadville, then known as California Gulch, and Fairplay. I think it was in the following spring, in June perhaps, that my wife in Denver received a letter from Miss Gertrude Osborne in Vermont, whom he had known distantly, making inquiries about Kimball. My wife forwarded the letter to me at Georgetown, where I was starting with a pack train over the range for the Blue River placer camps.
Miss Osborne wrote that she had last heard from Kimball some 8 or 9 months before at California Gulch, that she had waited long, and having exhausted every other means to hear from him, begged me to undertake at her expense any measures that might be necessary to discover his whereabouts or his fate. Her father had recently died, and she had now free control of ample means. And would I please communicate this fact to Mr. Kimball, the fact of her father's death?
How swiftly that delicate hint revealed to me the suppressed tragedy of these two fond hearts. The rich and proud old man had stood between the faithful girl and her lover. Yes, I would inquire about Kimball with all my heart and communicate the joyful tiding that nothing stood between him and his heart's desire. When I reached California Gulch with my pack train, I made a diligent search after the lost lover Kimball, but in vain. I went around from sluice to sluice among the washers, but nobody knew him. It was indeed like searching for a needle in a haymow to look for a stranger in the camps. That's when the placer washers told me,
"Say, boys, I wonder if 'tain't Dave Griffin's partner up in the hydraulic that this feller's looking for. I'll bet $1 'tis. Let me see, what the blazes what they called him. All the boys had nicknames here, mister, and if you knowed your chap's nickname, we could find him in a minute. But I'll bet it's that feller they called Yankee Mage up in the hydraulic that you're looking for. Did he have a dog? That feller had a big dog that was always with him, kind of a big, smooth shepherd dog. He'd been in the Army, and that's why they called him Mage, although I reckon he was not a major. If it was him you're after, you won't find him, for he's made his raise and pulled stakes up long ago. Him and Dave Griffin was together, but at the big cleanup last fall, he told Dave he'd made his homestake and was going to pull out for the East. He went from there to Canyon City. I know that because Griffin was awful worked up about it. And his partner going home, and he brought out his claim and went down as far as Canyon with him to see him off and didn't come back for a couple of weeks.
Finding this to be the condition of affairs, I dropped the matter, thinking that Kimball had probably departed for Vermont by that time. I learned that he had left Canyon on horseback, followed by a dog, and it occurred to me the man might have taken a fancy for riding all the way back and surprising his sweetheart. After hearing about the dog, I recalled that Kimball had a singular capacity for attaching animals to himself. The dog was a sagacious collie that he found one day at a deserted house near Fredericksburg, Virginia, and which had followed him all through the Army till his time was up and then was taken home with him. It was not only dogs, but the whole brute creation that he inspired with this affection for himself. Dave Griffin told me that he had gone as far as Canyon City with his partner and seen him off. Kimball had luck in the mines and had carried away with him over $10,000 in gold and banknotes. He rode a fine horse that he had kept for about a year, intending to go to Omaha by way of Denver and the North Platte route. Having learned this much, I communicated it to my wife, who in turn communicated it to Miss Osborne. The correspondence that had been opened was kept up between them for a year. My wife, sympathizing in the young lady's belief that her lover had meant foul play. Well, I held suspicions that he had fallen in with somebody better that he loved and had deserted her. But my life was very busy, and in fact, I paid little attention to the matter after the first inquiries. I was at Canyon City in 1867, sometime in September, I think, with all of my pack train loaded for fair play, when I received a letter from my wife saying that
Miss Osborne was at our house in Denver and desired to see me most urgently, and would I please come up at once, for the poor girl was heartbroken.
Gracious, In the rush of so much business to now take a horseback journey of 125 miles, all for sentiment? For a girl foolish enough to break her heart for any lubber? Still, I went. I admired her devotion while it annoyed me. To cross 2/3 of a continent, a large part of the way by stage, costing something both in money and courage in those days of Indian massacres? Perhaps Miss Osborne's devotion called to my mind the devotion of somebody else I will not name. At any rate, I went. It was mid-morning when I left Canyon. I planned to reach Colorado City by bedtime, get up the next morning, take another horse, and be in Denver that night. My horse was fresh. I took the road down the Arkansas, out from the river, hugging the foothills, past Beaver Creek. 16 miles made, and only noon. On to the Red Canyon and away for Steele's Ranch on Turkey Creek. Half of my day's journey was done. There I fed and rested for 2 hours and again sprung into my saddle at a little before 5. With the cool of the day before me, I could easily make the remaining 24 miles by 9 o'clock. But a hailstorm along the base of the mountains came down and drove me back to shelter. I was detained for more than 1 hour. While waiting under the shed, something prompted me to take out my wife's letter and read it again. I found there was a half sheet that had escaped my notice. It was not all that important and merely mentioned that
Miss Osborne had come to the conviction that her lover had been murdered. It had been borne in upon her mind that if she would come to Colorado, she would discover his body and be able to bring his murderer to justice. Since arriving in Denver, she had several nights in succession of the most horrifying dreams in which she seemed to see him in his death struggle with an enemy who was stabbing and slashing at him with a knife. The dreams had completely prostrated her, but she saw so distinctly the scene and its surroundings that she felt sure that she could make anyone as familiar with the country as I recognize it from the description. The minutest details of far and wide were graven on her brain, but a singular thing connected with all of her dreams, and that was the impression after every dream that as soon as the place of her lover's burial was discovered, she would die.
My wife felt that with the young lady's delicate condition, such a death might indeed ensue from the sheer effect of her imagination. Thus, my wife cautioned me not to humor her in the supposition that I might recognize the spot that she had described. Even if I were able to do so, my wife, being skeptical of such occult influences, thought it was unlikely. It was after 6 when the storm abated and I was able to start onward. From Steele's Ranch to the crossing of the Little Fountain, commonly called Uncle George's Ranch by the freighters, was 10 miles. And that distance I thought I could make by dark when the roughest of my road would be passed, but 14 miles would remain. Traveling on from Steele's Ranch to Colorado City, there were 2 routes, the old trail and the new road. The former was considerably shorter, but hugged the base of Cheyenne Mountain, going up and down over the foothills and crossing the many rough gulches or canyons that extend from the main range. The new road, though longer, was smoother and more level as it kept out from the foothills. This road was taken of late years by the freight teams passing between Denver and Canyon City. After I set out, I found that the adobe ground was too slippery for my horse to go out of a walk, so I turned onto the old trail, hoping to find it drier. But there was little difference, and I was obliged to creep along. The sky had been overcast since the storm, and because I was under the shadow of Cheyenne Mountain, The darkness came on fast. If worse came to worst, I knew of a little deserted cabin about 5 miles on in one of the gorges called Dead Man's Canyon, the canyon I mentioned when relating this story to you last fall. But with this thought came a memory, a recollection of some stories passed along, as such stories would be, by freighters and teamsters. It was soberly related that on several occasions within the last couple of years, travelers had come from the north to Steele's ranch in the night and reported that they had been pursued, followed, or accompanied from some distance along the mouth of Dead Man's Canyon by a spectral horse and a dog. Men only laughed at these stories in the daytime. I found that the women commonly believed them, and there was little doubt that they influenced the choice of routes to some extent by those who traveled after dark. There was no doubt that the travelers who had seen these specters had all been greatly horrified and ran away as fast as their beast could carry them. One had even fallen from his horse at a dead faint at Mr. Steele's door. These stories came back to me as I rode along. I was conscious only of being out on a wet and slippery road and the probability of not being able to get onto my journey's end before the hotel should be closed for the night. There's also the chance, too, that the streams might be swollen and dangerous in the dark. The more I reflected, the more advisable it seemed to me to consider the propriety of occupying the cabin in the gulch if I did not find the condition of the road improving. I do not intend to convey the impression that I gave no credence to the ghostly stories of Dead Man's Canyon. I distinctly assert, on the contrary, I had always thought there might be something worth investigating about the affair, only the chances seem strongly against the optical data being furnished to anybody capable of looking into its cause. If I felt no fear in approaching the place so dreadful to many, it is not because I do not believe in the possibility of ghosts, but precisely because I do. I agree with you that there can be no such thing as an isolated fact, a causeless event, but the bent of my mind is not and never has been to regard an apparition as a thing supernatural. It has always been my belief that the world is progressing gradually to higher and calmer spiritual planes, and that we shall sometime understand the rationale of these things that now only occasionally cause us horror and fright. But to the gist of the whole affair, I saw the apparitions. The darkness had fallen early and was not yet dense. Indeed, the occasional gleam of the new moon in the zenith through the clouds gave promise of a bright night for my journey, if the storm cleared away. I was 5 or 6 miles from Steele's ranch and near the mouth of the canyon in which stood the deserted cabin. I think this spot is clearly discernible from the Antlers Hotel in Colorado Springs. That's when I began to perceive a peculiar odor, faint and inconstant on the fresh air. It was vague, and I think I should not have noticed it, only that my horse began to sniff and prick up his ears and shake his head, as you may observe a horse will when approaching a dead carcass. Now, there is as much character in smells as in colors. This was faint, too faint indeed to be distinct, but it seemed to me to possess a trace of that peculiar sickening smell of the human cadaver. Do not imagine that this caused me any nervousness. I had too lately been in the army and slept among the dead to feel any timidity. Indeed, so far from making me think of the spook stories, it caused me to forget them, in thinking if any person could be lying dead around there, or any grave exposed by the coyotes. My horse became more and more demonstrative, and at last nearly threw me from the saddle by suddenly shying. When I came to look, I saw that a strange horse had just passed us and was making on at a long, steady, even stride toward the mouth of the canyon. At the first glance, I merely supposed it to be one of the numerous horses on the range that had strayed into the road. But the next view showed that it wore a saddle and a bridle. Swiftly concluding that the horse had either cast its rider back a distance or broken from its hitching, I spurred my own animal to overtake and stop it. But my horse refused to approach it. And I noticed for the first time that my poor beast was trembling with terror. The spook stories had not occurred to me to be connected with this little episode. If I had thought of it at all, I should have expected to see a spook taking on a white and ghastly aspect instead of this horse being a common bay color as far as I could perceive in the dim twilight. Unable to urge my animal forward to overtake the other, I sprang to the ground, took the lariat from the horn of my saddle, and hastily staking my own beast by the roadside, ran forward to stop the other animal. I undertook to get ahead of him, lest he should take to his heels and run away, but as I approached, I perceived for the first time a large dog was trudging wearily along at his heels. Even this suggested nothing to my mind of the hobgoblin stories. But the next instant, the whole affair was changed. As I passed the animal, the light shone out a little from the clouds, and looking toward the horse, I saw the bushes beyond him. Saw straight through his body, understand? My God, I said to myself, putting my hands on my eyes, it is the phantom horse. For one instant I was overcome, not with fright, at least I think not, but with amazement that I was much moved, I will not deny. I even felt my hair lifting my hat. But after the first instant, my coolness returned. The horse and the dog strode on, stopping when they came to the mouth of the canyon, as if undecided, and then turning up the trail that led to the deserted cabin. I could see the horse's heels through the dog's body. One was as much a phantom as the other. What prompted me to follow them, I do not know, yet I think I was impelled by an influence I could not have resisted. Another singular phenomenon became gradually perceptible. I saw a leg in the stirrup next to me. It was only a dim outline. I followed on towards the cabin. The door was off its hinges, the roof had partly fallen in, and the chimney was a ruin. The horse drew up at the door as if someone were dismounting, and the phantom dog followed its master into the building. In another moment, the dog reappeared. I saw the phantom leg in the stirrup again, and the horse started down the trail out of the canyon. Gradually, the figure in the saddle became more and more visible, and at last I saw it plainly. Dressed in a common suit of miner's clothes, with the broad-brimmed, leather-belted hat universal in the West, as it proceeded down the trail, it became more and more distinct until it seemed to be the very substance of a man. But all the while, there was a shadowy whiteness about it. I followed on at a little distance. They came to where the trail was crowded against the precipice by the deep wash of the little stream that gurgled down the canyon. Just where the trail narrowed to a mere bridle path, a huge mass of detached rock had fallen. As they were passing this, the horse suddenly shied and fell over the bank a distance of some 4 or 5 feet. The rider had been cast off, but with one foot in the stirrup. He was dragged after the horse. The dog had made a spring as if at the throat of some invisible foe, and the next instant he rolled over dead. The impression of the reality of the scene was so vivid in my mind that I ran forward to help the fallen man. And what follows passed in an instant. He was unable to disengage the foot from the stirrup, but I saw him rise on his knee and struggle for a moment as if beating off some foe, make an effort while holding off his assailant with one hand to draw his revolver with the other, and then sink back upon his horse with a huge dirk, a dagger, sticking in his breast. I saw blood gush out and sprang over the bank to lift him, but the whole thing vanished. I found myself now trembling from head to foot, but whether with excitement or fear, I shall not undertake to determine. The impression of reality had overpowered me. I was standing in the brook and the water was gurgling about my feet, but I was so weak that I had to sit down for a moment on a boulder in the stream. The next moment, I saw the horse and dog on the trail again, moving up the canyon. I rose and followed. We had gone but a few rods when the dog took into the bushes by the wall of the canyon, scratched the earth for an instant, and then with a whine as real to my senses as any sound I have ever heard, vanished as if he sank into the ground. The horse proceeded up the trail past the cabin and into the pinyon timber. He was a little the distance ahead of me and perhaps 10 or 15 rods from the trail, when he suddenly dropped to his knees as if shot, and with a groan rolled over and vanished. To describe my sensations at this moment would be to epitomize the history of terror. I am simply unable to do it. I remember a great prickly sensation over all of my body, and I remember scarcely anything else. Another thing, however, of equal interest, psychologically speaking, was the momentary belief, or rather fear, that I had lost my senses and was a maniac, and that this vision had only been conjured up in my disordered brain. I covered my face with my hands and gradually regained composure. Fear is a sensation subordinate to the will. Terror is not. Probably for that moment I had experienced a panic of horror. When I found myself calm, I went forward to the spot where I had seen the horse fall, and to my further astonishment, found a carcass and scattered bones lying there. The flesh had been torn away by wolves and coyotes, but enough of the carcass remained to show me that it was the body of a horse. Now, sir, I've related all of the story that you requested me to write, which I conceived to possess any real scientific interest, but I can tell you that the next morning, Mr. Steele's sons and myself found the body of a murdered man in that canyon, and identification of the body by means of a bracelet on the arm was that of one Oliver Kimball, a miner from California Gulch. We dug where the dog had disappeared and found the body with the dirk still sticking from his breast. On the blade of that dagger were 2 letters, D.G. When I reached Denver, my wife met me at the door in tears, saying,
"You're too late. Oh, why didn't you come sooner? The poor girl is dead. She had been so well and cheerful since I wrote for you. But the night before last, about 7:30, she fell into a nervous spasm. and at 9 o'clock, she was a corpse. She kept repeating over and over, "He is found at last. Oh, my darling, I am coming to you. I am setting off directly. My work is done. You will be avenged."
From 7:30 until 9 was the very time I had been following the phantom of the horse and the dog. I consider the connection between these two events worthy of your closest attention. I think that the source of the obscure connection between the two, though not without any parallels in the data of psychology, has never been intelligently explained. One last word. On my next visit to California Gulch, I carried with me the dagger found in Kimball's breast. Calling on Dave Griffin one day about noon when he was at his cabin, I related all of the circumstances of that night in Dead Man's Canyon. We were seated on a bench outside. He listened with lips drawn and blanched, but with a sardonic gleam in his eyes. At last, I drew the dagger from my pocket and pointed to the initials.
Are you the only person who knows of this?
No, at least a dozen are as familiar with it as myself, I answered.
Excuse me an instant.
I heard a sharp report of a revolver. And for just an instant, I thought the villain had shot me. When I got to the door, he had fallen, but he had coolly raised the weapon to his head and fired again. The papers said it was due to financial difficulties. I had my reasons then for keeping silent, and this is the first time the whole truth of the matter has been told. Yours truly, Marshall Felch.
You guys are great.
We believe.
No, that was an outstanding job. So that's the story. So I'm here, and if you got any questions, I think any of us might be able to answer. So has anybody got any questions about what happened?
So this is public? This one?
No, it's not. It was kind of interesting. The first time that we ever heard the story, it wasn't written by Marshall. It was written about Marshall and his offspring. When I mentioned his offspring that had found the story, the first time they'd heard the story, they had heard their mother tell the story growing up, which was Marshall and Amanda's daughter Sadie told her kids the story, just like what you just heard. They heard that story. But then about 1951, one of the offspring was in a shop, actually in Idaho, and he came across a little magazine and looked and found a story, and the story was about Marshall Felch. And it was titled, it was about Captain Marshall Felch. And so the offspring that had heard that story and then saw it in print, they embraced that story, and that's how they came to know Marshall. So it was about 2006 that we were doing a couple of things locally here, and we had located the family through some genealogical research, and they came to town, and they knew Marshall Felch as Captain Felch of that story. We didn't know that story. We only knew Marshall Felch because of his work as a dinosaur excavator. And so it was kind of interesting to see the two perspectives. But they heard that story, and it was exactly the same story. And later on, we found out that it had been printed and reprinted and reprinted and reprinted many times. So it was, but it was always reprinted as Marshall, about Marshall Felch, not a first person, like him telling the story. So that's the first time that story came out, was him writing the story. Yeah.
So where's the original letter?
The original letter was actually the only one that we've seen, that we've located, that would be the closest to the original letter, because we do have a lot of Marshall's letters that have been written to Professor Marsh. We've got hundreds of those, but I haven't seen the actual letter. I've seen it typed up. So a lady typed up the letter, and we found that, it was actually, Joanne was with me. We were in the Denver Public Library, and we were in the Western Archives, which is upstairs, and they have a room up there they call the Mullen Manuscript Room, and they keep things that are one of a kind. And so they let us in, and then we saw an original typed version of that letter along with some other information. And that was actually, Joanne actually got, it was, but not the original letter. The original, the thing that Fitzmac published was published on April 28th, 1884 in the Denver Herald.
And they have that at the Western District Collection?
Yeah, hang on. Excuse me. So, but we didn't see the letter, but we saw the typed version of the letter. Yeah.
So where's the dagger?
Yeah, where's the dagger?
Well, that's why you guys are all here, to help us find it. You know, this isn't free. We were. No, there are certain things that there no such a dagger has been found. There's no confirmation on a Oliver Kimball being murdered. There's no confirmation on a Dave Griffin being up there in the mountains, although there is Griffins locally, and but they don't have a record of anyone with that name. And there was some Griffins that did. A lot of people back in those days, those early 1860s, what was going on around here is people would come here. Canyon City was kind of more of a supply base. And then in the summertime, particularly the younger folks would go up to Leadville when that took off. And they would, get work in Leadville. Earlier, they're going up across South Park into the Breckenridge area and working up there.
Was there a Miss Osborne? Was there a Miss Osborne?
No such Miss Osborne has been found. So there's some things that are kind of in the story that are kind of interesting. Like, for example, there is a Dead Man's Canyon, and it actually is listed that way on the maps, but a lot of that has to do with the earlier death of Henry Harkins and the Espinosa murders that happened about three years before that. But there's a lot of the places, the Steel Ranch, all those things that are listed, those are real places. But there's no confirmation on these deaths. So,
And the cabin was probably originally Henry Harkin's cabin.
it's probably Henry Harkin's cabin, yeah. Yeah. Hang on.
Oh, I was just going to ask, you mentioned when they mentioned Colorado City, you're actually talking about Colorado Springs, right?
Yeah. When they talk about old Colorado City, it's going up that Colorado Avenue on the west side. And if you just go up there a little ways, there's a little, I think it's called Pioneer Park. It's not very big, but that's kind of the original area. Like most of the people that were coming north-south out of Denver down this direction. And then the way they would travel would be they were actually coming down, not the same route as like I-15. They were kind of hugging the mountains a little closer, like through Beaver Creek, that direction. And so they would actually, come, and they could make it pretty fast. Like, I'm sure Marshall, if he had to, could have made it fairly quickly on a horse. He was for those first 2 or 3 years that they were in Colorado, they bought land here. They were actually, him and Amanda had started a boarding house in a place called Montezuma. Montezuma is a little silver mining town just south of where Keystone Ski Resort is. And so they were coming running back and forth between the place up in Garden Park, and they'd go up that direction and then go kind of like if you're going up the road up towards Hartselle. If you're going up like Highway 9, that direction, and then they'd cut across towards Fairplay and then up over the mountains, that direction. Yeah. So they were all through all of these mountains in those early years. Yeah. Joanne, what were you asking? Henry Harkins was the second. There was about 33. I think it was 33 people were murdered in that summer by the Espinosas, and Henry was the second. First one was closer here to Canyon City. I can't remember.
The first one was a judge, I think, on Hardscrabble.
Yeah. So there was a kind of a string of murders, and then that took place, and so that place where Marshall's traveling through, where he had his experience, is that same canyon. And one of the things that was going on is in those early days is there was a lot of ghost stories going on. And so he would have heard those stories over and over again when he would be traveling through there on his own. So what exactly happened, and I don't know. Yeah. So that was kind of a pretty interesting. You guys, you really seriously, you're really good, and the dog was good too.
Spectral dog.
Yeah, spectral. Yeah.
And where's my old prospector? Oh, old prospector! Yay!
Get out back there, yeah.
Yeah, he did a really good job on the old prospector, the way they would talk. But when they were talking about that, they were talking about people, and there was a lot of that kind of conversation going on, of the way people talked. So yeah, that was captured really nicely. So thanks. Thank you guys. Yeah. And Joanne has about three tons of cookies back there. Yeah, 2 tons now, so yeah.